In just 24 hours, I lost everything. My job, my husband, even my family turned their backs on me. They called me a failure. But what they never saw coming was how I rose from the ashes and changed my life forever. My name is Claire Thompson, and until last Monday morning, I thought I had everything figured out. At 34 years old, I was the marketing director of Whitman & Price, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in New England. My resume sparkled with honors magna cum laude from Boston University, a steady climb up the corporate ladder, and industry awards that I used to polish late at night while sipping a glass of Cabernet. If you had asked me a week ago who I was, I would have said a professional, a perfectionist, the daughter who never settled for less than first place. From the outside, it looked like I was winning the game of life. But here's the truth. I didn't tell anyone I was exhausted from trying to meet expectations that weren't even mine. My father, Robert Thompson, had hammered into me since childhood that success wasn't optional. It was the bare minimum. My husband, Mark Evans, wore his insecurities like expensive suits, charming in public, resentful behind closed doors. And I, ever the dutiful daughter, ever the ambitious wife, kept playing my role. Then in the span of 24 hours, it all collapsed. That Monday began like any other, a pot of French press coffee, a glance at my calendar with back-to-back client calls, and a silent prayer that I could avoid another confrontation with Jonathan Miller, my new VP, who seemed to relish undermining me. By 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with an email marked urgent from HR. I assumed it was about budget planning. Instead, the subject line read, "Meeting request. Immediate attendance required." Walking into the glass-walled conference room, I saw Pamela from HR already seated, her posture stiff, eyes rehearsed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips like he'd been waiting for this moment. Claire, Pamela began in that sterile HR tone people use when they want to sound empathetic, but don't dare feel it. "Thank you for coming on short notice. We regret to inform you that due to departmental restructuring, your position is being eliminated." The words slammed into me. My chest tightened. Eliminated. As if 3 years of bringing in high-value clients, late nights, refining strategies, weekends sacrificed for presentations, none of it mattered. "This isn't performance-based," Pamela added quickly, as if that softened the blow. But I saw Jonathan's satisfied glance. We all knew it was a lie. I wanted to argue, to lay out numbers, metrics, glowing reviews from clients. But my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, numb. "Security will assist you in gathering your belongings," Pamela continued. The humiliation was sharp like lemon juice in an open cut. By 11:00 a.m., I was standing on the sidewalk with a cardboard box of my things, framed certificates, a coffee mug that said "Boss Lady," and a photo of Mark and me smiling in front of our colonial-style house. People rushed past me, their conversations about lunch plans and deadlines, while my world felt like it had been ripped off its axis. As I drove home, my mind wasn't just on losing my job. It drifted back decades to my father's voice. I was 10 years old, holding up a report card with a B+ in math. I had worked hard, proud of myself. Dad barely looked at it before saying, "Second best is no better than failure, Claire." My mother, Linda, touched my shoulder gently, her eyes full of sympathy. But she didn't speak. She never contradicted him. Her silence became the wallpaper of my childhood, always present, never protective. That B+ haunted me. It wasn't a grade, it was a sentence. A lifelong reminder that anything less than perfection was unacceptable. Even as an adult sitting in corner offices and signing off million-dollar campaigns, I still heard his voice every time I fell short of impossible standards. And now losing my job felt like proving him right. When I pulled into our driveway at 11:30 a.m., I noticed Mark's car already there. Odd, he rarely came home during work hours. For a fleeting moment, I felt relief. Maybe sharing the news with him would ease the sting. Maybe my husband would tell me I was more than my job, that we'd figure it out together. Mark, I called, stepping through the garage door into the quiet house. No answer. Upstairs, muffled sounds leaked from our bedroom, an unmistakable rhythm of intimacy. My heart plummeted. I pushed open the door and froze. Mark was tangled in our sheets with Jessica Reed, his colleague I had met briefly at a company holiday party. The scene felt like slow motion. Mark scrambling Jessica, clutching the sheets, both their faces wide with a mix of guilt and defiance. My throat went dry. How long Mark didn't hesitate. 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of pretending to work late, of smelling faint perfume that wasn't mine, of dismissing my gut instincts. "Get out," I whispered, though my voice shook. "Both of you." Mark laughed bitterly. "Out, this is our house, Claire. I pay half the mortgage, and considering you're unemployed now, how exactly do you plan to keep it?" His words sliced deeper than any knife. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. Caller ID Dad. Perfect timing, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife. I ignored the call, but a text popped up seconds later. "Come to the house immediately. Your mother and I need to speak with you." Hours later, I stood in my parents' dining room. Dad sat at the head of the table, his posture like a CEO reviewing quarterly losses. My mother poured water, her hands trembling slightly. "I spoke with Jonathan today." Dad began, not even bothering to ask how I was. "He told me you were let go. Concerns about your performance, your commitment." I flinched. Of course, Jonathan was his golf buddy. The sabotage now made perfect sense. "Dad, that's not enough." He cut me off. "Perhaps if you'd focused more on your marriage and less on climbing the corporate ladder, this wouldn't have happened." My mother quietly, "Robert, that's not fair. Life isn't fair, Linda. And Claire needs to hear the truth." His gaze burned into me. "You've failed at work. You've failed at marriage. Right now, your results show failure on all fronts." The room spun. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Finally, I whispered, "Thank you for dinner, Mom. I should go." As I reached the door, Dad's voice chased me like a whip. "You have 1 week to get your life together. Pack your bags if you can't." That night, I sat in my car outside a hotel, staring at the glowing vacancy sign through tear-blurred eyes. In less than a day, I had lost my job, my husband, my father's approval, and possibly my home. Inside the silence of my rented room, I curled on the bed, clutching a pillow, shaking with sobs that came from the pit of my stomach. Yet somewhere beneath the grief, a quiet voice whispered, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." I didn't believe it yet, but I wanted to. Looking back, what happened that day was more than a string of betrayals. It was the dismantling of a false self I had worn for decades. The ambitious daughter trying to please an unpleasant father. The supportive wife carrying the weight of a resentful husband. The flawless executive proving her worth through numbers and titles. When all of that crumbled, so did the illusion. In psychology, we call this a fragmentation crisis, when every external anchor collapses at once, forcing the individual to confront the raw core of identity. Some people break. Others, if they dare, rebuild from a place of authenticity. For me, that night in the hotel, I had no idea which one I would be. The bedside clock glowed 200 a.m. I hadn't slept. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every harsh word, every betrayal. I thought of my father's ultimatum, my husband's smirk, Jonathan's satisfied eyes. I whispered into the darkness, "You haven't seen the last of me." It was the faintest spark, but it was enough to light the path forward. I barely slept that night at the Harborview Inn. The hum of the old air conditioner, the faint traffic outside, none of it mattered. My mind wouldn't stop replaying my father's voice. "You've failed at work. You've failed at marriage. You've failed on all fronts. Failure." The word clung to me like smoke after a fire. But the truth was, I had been living under that word since childhood. Long before Whitman and Price, long before Mark, long before Jonathan Miller ever decided I was expendable. I grew up in a 2-story brick house in suburban Massachusetts. On the outside, it looked warm and welcoming manicured lawn, white shutters, a swing set in the backyard. But inside, it was more factory than home, a factory that produced perfect children. My father, Robert Thompson, was the foreman. He'd risen from salesman to regional manager at a manufacturing company, and he wore his climb like a medal pinned to his chest. To him, the world was binary winners, and losers had no place at his table. I was the eldest, the experiment, the one on whom he tested his theories. I remember one Friday evening, 3rd grade. I came home waving a math test, 98%. I was glowing cheeks pink with pride. 2 questions wrong, I announced, still grinning. Dad barely looked up from the evening paper. Why not 100? The smile died on my face. My mother, Linda, patted my back softly. 98 is wonderful, honey. But Dad snapped his fingers, pointing at her as if she'd spoken out of turn. Don't sugarcoat mediocrity, Linda. I learned that night what it meant to chase approval that would never come. Our living room had a polished oak shelf, lined with trophies spelling B-Debate Team piano recitals. All mine. At school, I was known as the overachiever, the girl who always raised her hand, who studied during recess. My teachers adored me. My classmates? Not so much. But those trophies weren't really mine. They belonged to my father. Each time I won, his chest puffed, his handshake firmer when neighbors congratulated him. Each time I placed second, his face tightened, jaw clenched, and the dinner table fell into icy silence. I once overheard him telling a neighbor Claire's smart, but she's not consistent. She slips. He said it as though I weren't standing right there. That sentence lodged in my chest like shrapnel. Not consistent. Slips. Words that turned into fuel for late nights hunched over textbooks, for extra rehearsals on piano pieces until my fingers bled. My mother loved me, I know she did, but she was also complicit. I can still see her in the kitchen apron dusted with flour listening as Dad criticized my report card. She'd place a gentle hand on mine under the table, eyes full of sympathy, but her lips stayed sealed. Her silence was deafening. Sometimes I wanted to scream, "Say something, defend me, tell him I'm enough." But she never did. She had lived nearly 4 decades in his shadow. Submission was her survival strategy. And as a child, I mistook it for agreement. So I internalized the message I wasn't just performing for my father. I was performing for my mother's unspoken approval too. If I could be perfect, maybe she wouldn't have to live with his anger. By the time I hit high school, I was a machine. AP classes stacked one after another, honor society meetings, varsity debate. I slept 4 hours a night and drank black coffee before most kids my age knew what caffeine even was. The funny thing, nobody ever asked me what I wanted. Not my father, not my teachers, not even me. The only question was, what's next? I won state debate. Dad asked why it wasn't nationals. I graduated valedictorian. He asked what scholarships I'd turned down. I landed my first job at Whitman and Price. He asked when I'd make director. The bar kept moving, always just out of reach. And like a trained dog, I kept leaping. Sitting in that dim hotel room after losing everything, I realized how deeply those patterns had run my life. Losing my job wasn't just about corporate politics. It was about failing to keep up the act I'd been performing since I was a child. Mark's betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about me choosing ambition over domestic perfection, a choice that in my father's eyes made me less of a woman. And my father's condemnation wasn't new. It was the same voice I had heard since I was 10 years old, holding a B+ in my trembling hands. Lying awake, I imagined confronting my younger self. Little Claire clutching that math test, eyes wide with hope. "I'm sorry," I whispered in my mind. "You should have been hugged, not scolded. You should have been told that 98% was incredible, that mistakes make you human, not defective." I pictured my father's stern face, and for the first time, I didn't shrink. I looked him in the eye, even in memory, and said, "You were wrong. I was never a failure. I was a child." From a clinical standpoint, I now understand this as intergenerational perfectionism. Parents who equate love with achievement pass down a legacy of anxiety, low self-worth, and workaholism. My father's demand for excellence wasn't about me, it was about him. About proving to himself, to the neighbors, to his own ghost of insecurity, that he had raised a winner. But as a child, you can't separate that. You absorb it as truth. If I am not perfect, I am unlovable. This belief drove me straight into the arms of a man like Mark, whose charm masked his resentment, and into a career where burnout was a badge of honor. That realization hit me like a tidal wave. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, notebook in hand, scribbling furiously. Job gone. Husband gone. Father's approval, never truly had it. Safety net. Maybe the beach house. Maybe the shares in Horizon Tech. I underlined that last part 3 times. For years, I had kept those assets hidden even from Mark. A secret inheritance from my grandfather. The one person who had ever looked at me and said, "Claire, you're enough exactly as you are." It was as though his foresight reached across time, handing me the keys to survival. As dawn crept through the thin hotel curtains, I closed the notebook and whispered, "This ends now. Not the grief, not the anger. Those would take time. But the cycle, the endless chasing of approval, the striving for standards that were never mine. If I had lost everything, maybe it was finally time to build something real. I didn't know what that looked like yet, but for the first time, the possibility thrilled me. It was 5 years earlier at a business conference in New York City. I was 29, ambitious, confident, and determined to prove myself among executives twice my age. That's when I first saw Mark Evans. He was standing near the bar, effortlessly charming, the kind of man who seemed to own the air around him. Tall, crisp suit, a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical client. Our eyes met across the room. He raised his glass, as if toasting me from afar. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers. By the end of the week, we'd gone on 2 dates. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Looking back, I realize it wasn't just Mark I was falling for. It was the story he represented, the power couple, the glamorous life, the illusion that I had finally made it. Our wedding was the kind you'd see in magazines, a sprawling estate in Connecticut, ivory flowers, a string quartet playing beneath a canopy of chandeliers. My dress cost more than I earned in a month, but I didn't pay for it. My father did. In fact, my father paid for almost everything, and he never let me forget it. During the reception, while guests toasted our future, Dad leaned in and whispered, "Remember who made this possible, Claire." I smiled for the cameras, but inside I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Even on my wedding day, love came with strings attached. Mark, meanwhile, thrived in the spotlight. He shook hands, told jokes, clinked champagne glasses. He looked every bit the devoted husband-to-be, and I wanted so badly to believe it. After the honeymoon, we moved into a colonial-style house in an upscale Connecticut suburb. Brick facades, symmetrical windows, manicured hedges. The kind of place people drive past and think they must have it all together. We hosted dinner parties with fine wine and artisanal cheeses. Guests commented on our beautiful home, our rising careers, our perfect marriage. But perfection is a dangerous mask. Behind the heavy front door, silence often replaced conversation. I worked late hours answering emails from the sofa while Mark poured himself another drink. He joked at first Preston and Shaw owns you now, but jokes hardened into bitterness. Another late night he'd say, his voice sharp. I guess your clients are more important than your husband. At first I brushed it off. I told myself it was stress from his job. Mark was a sales executive at a pharmaceutical company, and the pressure to hit numbers was constant. But soon, I noticed the way his eyes narrowed whenever I mentioned a promotion, or how quickly he changed the subject when I shared good news. The higher I climbed, the smaller he seemed to feel. When I was named marketing director at 31, a milestone I had worked my entire 20s for, he didn't celebrate. He barely looked up from his laptop. Good for you, he muttered, then launched into a story about a deal he was closing. That night I cried quietly in the shower, not because I needed his approval, but because I wanted his joy. And it wasn't there. We became experts in performance. At dinner parties, we laughed at each other's jokes, held hands, posed for photos. Neighbors admired us. Friends envied us. But when the guests left and the dishes were cleared, we retreated to opposite corners of the house. I'd curl up in the study, laptop open, immersed in campaigns. Mark would disappear into the den, television, blaring whiskey in hand. Sometimes I'd draft little notes, I miss us, I want to feel close again, but I never gave them to him. They piled up in a drawer, unsent letters to a man who was slipping further away. From the outside, it looked like a dream, but it felt like a cage. A golden cage, yes, lined with luxury cars, high-end vacations, the best restaurants. But a cage, nonetheless, because luxury without love is still imprisonment. Appearances without intimacy are still loneliness. And the cruelest part, I had helped build that cage. With every yes to my father's conditions, with every sacrifice to keep the image intact, with every silence in the face of Mark's resentment, I was reinforcing the bars. In therapy terms, what I was experiencing was emotional dependency disguised as independence. Outwardly, I looked like the independent career woman. Inwardly, I was still the child chasing her father's approval, now transposed onto a husband. Every time Mark dismissed my success, a part of me shrank, thinking, maybe if I work harder, he'll be proud. Maybe if I give more, he'll see me. But just as with my father, the bar kept moving, and I kept running on the treadmill, never catching up. One night, after a particularly brutal week at work, I came home to find Mark already drunk. You know what your problem is, he slurred. You think you're better than me. With your fancy title, your big salary. You think you're the prize. I froze. His words sliced open the wound I had tried to bury. I never said that, I whispered. You don't have to, he sneered. It's all over your face. That night, I slept in the guest room, alone, and for the first time, I admitted to myself that love wasn't what kept us together. It was fear of what people would say, fear of disappointing my father, fear of admitting I had chosen wrong. Weeks later, during Sunday dinner, I lingered in the kitchen with my mother, while Dad lectured my younger brother in the dining room. Mom, I asked softly, did you ever feel trapped? She looked at me startled. Then she sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Of course. But we make our choices, Claire, and sometimes we live with them. Her words sank like stones in my stomach. Was I doomed to live with mine? Looking back now, I see how the cracks had been forming long before the explosion of betrayal. The distance, the resentment, the unsent letters, they were the warning signs. But like a prisoner who decorates the walls of her cell, I convinced myself it was fine, that the gilded cage was better than no cage at all, until the day the cage shattered and I was forced to face the truth. Lying awake in that hotel bed after everything fell apart, I finally connected the dots. Mark's betrayal wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of years of silent wars, unspoken disappointments, and a marriage built more on appearances than on love. And as painful as it was, a strange clarity came with the realization the cage was gone. The bars had been ripped apart. And maybe, just maybe, I was free. Every golden cage has cracks, and mine began showing at work long before the walls of my marriage collapsed. Whitman and Price had once felt like my sanctuary. I thrived there for nearly a decade, pitching bold campaigns, mentoring younger staff, building relationships with clients who trusted me. My office was a reflection of my climb, the framed awards on the wall, the city view from the 12th floor, the endless stream of projects that carried my fingerprints. But 18 months before my termination, a new presence arrived: Jonathan Miller, Vice President of Marketing. A man with a too bright smile and a handshake that lingered a beat too long, as if trying to assert ownership the moment your palm touched his. From the beginning, I knew he didn't like me. Or perhaps more accurately, he liked what I represented: the old guard, the people who had thrived under collaborative leadership. Jonathan came with a different vision, one that didn't include me. It started small. A presentation I'd polished for days suddenly opened with missing charts during a client pitch. I knew I had double-checked those slides. The error made me stumble, flushing red as the client frowned. Jonathan jumped in smoothly. "Don't worry, I'll clarify this section," as if he'd been waiting for me to fail. Then there were the emails. Clients swore they hadn't received my responses yet. My outbox showed nothing. "Maybe you forgot to hit send," Jonathan remarked in meetings, his tone dripping with faux concern. At first, I gaslit myself. Maybe I was careless. Maybe I was stretched too thin. But deep down, I knew. The ground beneath me was being deliberately shaken. One afternoon, as I stood in line at the cafe downstairs, my colleague, Sophie Adams, leaned in. "They're pushing out the old guard," she whispered, eyes darting nervously around. "Anyone here before Jonathan is at risk. They want their own people." I tried to laugh it off. "You sound paranoid," but Sophie's face was pale. "I've seen this before. They make you doubt yourself, sabotage small things until you look incompetent, then call it restructuring." Her words stuck to me like burrs I couldn't shake off. Over the following months, the pattern became undeniable. Projects I initiated were reassigned without explanation. In meetings, Jonathan cut me off mid-sentence, only to repeat my ideas 5 minutes later, as if they were his own. When I complained to HR, they nodded politely, then filed my concerns into oblivion. I began to notice the sideways glances of younger colleagues, the way they hesitated before looping me into emails as if unsure whether I still carried influence. The walls were closing in. And worst of all, I began to question myself. Maybe I am slipping. Maybe Dad was right. I'm not consistent. The final blow came when I discovered Jonathan wasn't just any executive. He was one of my father's golf buddies. I found out the day my father casually mentioned over Sunday dinner, "Jonathan says you've been struggling at work." The steak knife froze in my hand. Jonathan had been feeding him information, or rather, misinformation. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. The man undermining me at work was sitting beside my father on Saturday mornings, laughing over swings and putts, shaping the narrative of his disappointing daughter. And of course, my father believed him. From that point, paranoia became my shadow. I triple-checked emails only to have them vanish. I rehearsed presentations until dawn, only for files to mysteriously corrupt. I started recording myself at work, scribbling notes in journals like a conspiracy theorist, desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Sleep slipped away. Coffee became oxygen. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, hollow-eyed brittle, a woman held together by caffeine and fear. The termination itself was almost anticlimactic. Pamela from HR read the script, departmental restructuring, not a performance-based decision. Jonathan sat across from me, arms folded, expression neutral, but I saw the glimmer in his eyes. Security escorted me out. My colleagues avoided eye contact, and as I stepped into the sunlight clutching that cardboard box, a wave of humiliation washed over me so fierce I thought I might collapse. I had given this place my 20s, my early 30s, late nights, missed holidays, endless sacrifice. And in the end, I was disposable. Walking to my car, I heard my father's voice again. Second place is no better than failure, Claire. It was as though the 10-year-old girl with the B+ had returned, clutching her test paper, waiting for approval that would never come. And now, she was 34, standing on the sidewalk with a box of broken illusions. That night, I thought of my grandfather. He'd been the only man who looked at me and saw more than performance. "You don't need to win to be worthy," he once told me, sitting with me on his porch, the smell of pipe tobacco in the air. "Your value isn't a scoreboard, Claire. Remember that." I hadn't remembered. Not until now. His inheritance, the beach house, the shares in Horizon Tech, were more than financial safety nets. They were proof that someone had believed in me without conditions. And suddenly, I clung to that belief like a lifeline. In psychology, there's a term for what I endured: corporate gaslighting. A strategy where leaders manipulate environments to make competent employees doubt themselves. It creates self-blame, erodes confidence, and isolates the target until they're too weak to resist. Jonathan had mastered it, and my father had enabled it. The damage wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the corrosion of identity. But sometimes identity needs to be stripped bare before it can be rebuilt. As painful as it was, being forced out revealed the truth I had been living on: borrowed worth. Worth defined by bosses, by titles, by my father's approval. Now stripped of all that, the question remained: who am I when no one is applauding? I sat in my hotel room, box of belongings at my feet, and opened my laptop. Not for Whitman and Price. Not for Jonathan. For me. I began typing, not strategies or campaigns, but raw thoughts, unfiltered. Pages poured out grief and fury, braided together with flickers of hope. For the first time, the words weren't for presentation. They weren't for approval. They were mine. And in that moment, I realized Jonathan hadn't destroyed me. He'd freed me. If the weeks leading up to my termination had felt like a slow bleed, the next 24 hours were the amputation. By noon on Monday, I was unemployed. By 2 o'clock, I was betrayed. By 6, I was disowned. And by midnight, I was sitting in a hotel room, staring at an empty bank account, wondering if I even existed outside of the roles that had just been ripped away. This wasn't just a bad day. It was the day every mask I'd ever worn was ripped off my face. Leaving Whitman and Price with a cardboard box in my arms, I felt hollow. The spring air should have been warm, but my skin prickled with cold sweat. Driving home, I rehearsed what I would say to Mark. I lost my job today. Maybe he'd hug me. Maybe he'd say, "We'll get through this together." I held on to that fantasy all the way up the driveway. His car was already parked outside. Rare. He almost never came home before 6. My chest tightened with relief until I noticed his briefcase tossed haphazardly in the hallway, his jacket on the stairs. The sounds reached me before the sight did. Muffled laughter, the creak of the mattress. I pushed open the door, and there he was, my husband, with Jessica Reed, in our bed. The world went white hot and then eerily silent. How long? My voice was barely audible. Mark didn't flinch. 6 months? 6 months of lies? 6 months of his late nights, his vague excuses, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. "Get out," I whispered, though my hands shook so violently I could barely clutch the doorframe. "Both of you." Jessica looked stricken, clutching the sheets. Mark laughed. "This is my house too, Claire. I pay half the mortgage." "And speaking of money," his smirk widened. "How's that gonna work now that you're unemployed?" As if timed by some cruel director, my phone buzzed. "Caller ID, Dad." I let it ring. A moment later, a text. "Come to the house immediately. Your mother and I need to speak with you." "Perfect," Mark sneered. "Daddy to the rescue. Maybe he can fix this one too." I wanted to scream, to throw something. Instead, I turned, walked downstairs, and left them there. By evening, I was at my parents' house, sitting at the same oak dining table where I'd spent my childhood, being grilled about grades and trophies. Dad sat at the head posture like a CEO conducting performance reviews. Mom poured water silently. My younger brother William shifted uncomfortably. "I spoke with Jonathan today," Dad said. "He told me you were let go. Concerns about your performance. Your commitment." My throat tightened. "That's not 'don't interrupt,'" he snapped. "Perhaps if you'd focused more on your marriage and less on climbing the corporate ladder, this wouldn't have happened." "Are you seriously blaming me for Mark's affair?" My voice cracked. "Life isn't fair, Claire, and you need to hear the truth. You've failed at work. You've failed at marriage. Right now, your results show failure on all fronts." The words hit harder than any fist. Dad William interjected quietly. Maybe we should hear Claire's side. But Dad ignored him. Mom's eyes met mine, full of sympathy, but her lips stayed shut as always. I stood abruptly. "Thank you for dinner, Mom." "I think I should go." "Claire," she whispered, reaching out. "Let her go," Dad barked. "Maybe some time alone will help her reflect on her choices." By midnight, I was sitting on a stiff hotel bed, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. My bank account balance blinked at me, 0.0. Mark had emptied it. $45,000. Gone. A text pinged, needed to secure funds for upcoming expenses. "We'll talk division of assets with lawyers." Expenses. That's what my life had been reduced to. I closed the laptop, pressed my palms to my eyes, and sobbed until my chest hurt. Who was I without my job? Who was I without my marriage? Who was I if my own father looked at me and saw nothing but failure? The questions circled like vultures, and the answer whispered by the darkest corners of my mind was terrifying. Maybe I'm no one at all. I remembered being 12, standing on stage at a spelling bee, tripping over the word serendipity, my father's face in the audience, hard and unblinking. I remembered staying up until 2 a.m. in college, studying until my hands cramped because a professor had once hinted I could do better. I remembered Mark on our wedding day whispering, "We're unstoppable, you and me." All of it felt like a cruel joke now. At 2 a.m., I called the only person I could think of, Rachel Morgan, my best friend since college. She arrived 40 minutes later, hair in a messy bun, eyes wide with worry. "Claire," she gasped, pulling me into a hug. What happened? I told her everything. The job, the affair, my father's condemnation, the bank account. By the time I finished, she was crying too. "This is insane. You've been set up, by all of them." Her words were a balm and a dagger at once. From a psychological perspective, what I endured that day was a total identity collapse. Work, marriage, family, finances. Every external anchor was cut loose in a single day. Most people define themselves by these roles. Take them away, and the self feels hollow, undefined. That's why grief feels like annihilation, not just the loss of others, but the loss of the self we knew through them. That night, I wasn't just mourning a job or a husband. I was mourning the version of me who had believed those things defined her. As dawn crept through the blinds, I remembered something. The beach house, the shares in Horizon Tech, my grandfather's gift. For years, I'd kept them hidden even from Mark. Maybe part of me had known I'd need them someday. Now they weren't just assets. They were proof that someone, at least one person in this world, had believed in me without conditions. And clinging to that thought, I finally slept. When I woke, sunlight poured into the room. My eyes were swollen, my throat raw. But there was something else too, a flicker. Not hope. Not yet, but defiance. Because if I had truly lost everything, maybe that meant I was finally free to build something real. The morning after my darkest night, I stood at the window of the Harborview Inn, watching the sun rise over the parking lot. The light looked indifferent, unmoved by the fact that my world had collapsed 12 hours earlier. But something inside me shifted as I watched it. A whisper, barely audible. If the sun can rise after the night, maybe so can I. I had no plan, no roadmap, just ruins at my feet. But ruins are where rebuilding begins. Rachel pressed a business card into my hand. Call her. She's one of the best divorce attorneys in Rhode Island. Fierce, smart, and she hates men who think they can get away with everything. Her name was Diane Hopkins. I dialed the number with trembling fingers. When her voicemail picked up, I left a message, my voice steadier than I felt. Diane, this is Claire Thompson. I need your help protecting what's mine. Her office smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Diane herself was brisk, sharp-eyed, dressed in a navy suit that radiated authority. Adultery is grounds for divorce in Rhode Island, she said after hearing my story. And since he's already emptied your joint account, we'll file immediately for financial misconduct as well. The words were clinical, but her eyes softened. You're not the first woman to sit in that chair, Claire. And you won't be the last. But you're in a stronger position than most. You have separate assets he doesn't know about. That's leverage. Leverage! The word felt foreign in my mouth. For months, I'd been nothing but cornered. To imagine power, even a sliver of it, was like inhaling fresh air after nearly drowning. That night, back at the hotel, I pulled out my notebook and wrote 3 promises to myself. 1. I will rebuild my life on my own terms, not my father's, not my husband's. 2. I will never again make myself small to fit into someone else's ego. 3. I will remember this bottom not to dwell in it, but to measure how high I will climb. I underlined the third one twice. 2 days later, I drove to Rhode Island and unlocked the beach house for the first time in years. The air smelled of salt and cedar, the ocean stretched out like an endless promise. This is home now, I whispered aloud. It was quiet. Too quiet. At night, the waves outside felt like a heartbeat, reminding me that the world was still moving, even if I wasn't sure I could. Some nights, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon until my eyes blurred, wondering if I'd ever feel safe again. But slowly, the house began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a canvas. Zoe, a junior colleague from Whitman and Price, drove down one weekend. She carried an external hard drive and a nervous look. Jonathan redirected all your client emails to himself, she explained. For months. He responded pretending to be you, but he deliberately missed requests. I couldn't watch it anymore. When she handed me the drive, my hands shook. Proof. Not just suspicions. Evidence that my downfall had been engineered. I hugged her so tightly she laughed nervously. Claire, you're going to burn them down with this. One night, I sat on the back porch of the beach house, listening to the surf, and thought of my grandfather again. Claire, he once told me people will try to measure you by numbers, grades, salaries, titles, But the real measure is whether you can stand back up after they knock you down. I hadn't understood then. I did now. Rachel came to visit the following weekend. We sat with mugs of tea, the ocean roaring beyond the windows. "Do you think I'm broken?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I think you're molten. Right now you're in the fire, but when you cool, you'll be stronger than steel." I laughed, the sound surprising even me. "Steel, huh, steel," she said firmly. In psychology, there's a concept called post-traumatic growth, the idea that sometimes the most devastating crises can become the soil where resilience grows. But growth doesn't feel like growth at first. It feels like ashes. It feels like waking up every morning to emptiness. It feels like loss stretching on forever. What makes it growth is the decision, sometimes tiny, sometimes barely perceptible, to move anyway. To take one step, however shaky, toward a new self. That's what the beach house became for me, a place to take shaky steps. I reached out to Alex and Zoe, two early investors in Horizon Tech, the startup my grandfather had left me shares in. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Rhode Island and Connecticut. "I want to formalize my advisory role," I told them. "Marketing strategy is what I do best, and I want to accelerate the next funding round. Whitman and Price is unstable, clients are leaving. This is our window." They exchanged glances. "We've been considering bringing on marketing leadership," Alex admitted. "Your background would be perfect." For the first time in months, I felt something spark inside me. Not just survival. Possibility. Not all ghosts stayed gone. One night, just past midnight, I heard pounding on the beach house door. Mark's voice slurred through the wood. "Claire, open up. We need to talk." I didn't. I called the police instead. Watching him being escorted off the property, his face twisted in rage, I felt both terror and relief. He no longer had power here. It wasn't Mark who surprised me most. It was Jessica. Weeks later, she called me, her voice shaky. "Claire, I need to tell you something." He lied to me too. We met at a diner halfway between Rhode Island and Connecticut. She looked younger in daylight, barely 25, her hands trembling around her coffee mug. "He told me you two were separated," she confessed. I didn't know until that night. I studied her face. She wasn't my enemy. She was just another casualty of Mark's ego. As summer deepened, I worked with Diane to file the divorce papers, armed with evidence of adultery and financial misconduct. At the same time, I funneled my energy into Horizon Tech. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building. One morning, sitting on the porch with coffee in hand, I wrote in my notebook, "True security doesn't come from jobs, marriages, or approval. It comes from knowing that even if everything burns, you can rise again." I underlined it, because now I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to rise. The beach house had become my cocoon. But cocoons aren't meant for hiding forever. They're meant for transformation. I had survived the collapse. Now came the harder part, creating something new out of the ashes. The question was no longer, who am I without them? The question was, who do I want to become? I didn't have an office. I didn't have staff. What I had was a weathered oak desk by the window of the beach house, my laptop, and the relentless rhythm of the Atlantic outside. That desk became the birthplace of Wilson Strategic Communications. I registered the name one rainy Thursday, heart pounding, as I clicked submit on the business license application. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration I will no longer beg for a seat at someone else's table. I'll build my own. The first client call came a week later. David Nichols, a former Whitman and Price client who had grown disillusioned with their new leadership. "Claire," he said over the phone, "I've always trusted your instincts. I want you, not them." I hung up and cried, not from despair this time, but from the strange, raw joy of being chosen for me. Starting fresh was terrifying. Every invoice I sent felt like holding my breath. Every new email from a potential client made my pulse race. But fear wasn't my enemy anymore. Fear was evidence that I was alive, that I was daring to step into the unknown instead of curling into the safety of old patterns. At night, I lay awake, not from dread, but from possibility. What if this works? What if I'm finally free? My role at Horizon Tech deepened quickly. In strategy sessions, I laid out bold campaigns. We leveraged social media in ways Preston and Shaw had ignored, highlighting transparency and customer trust. Within weeks, engagement metrics soared. Investors noticed. One afternoon, Alex leaned across the table. "Claire, your strategies are the reason we're attracting new capital. We want you formally on the leadership team. Leadership team. Not as someone's pawn, not as someone's expendable scapegoat, as an equal." I said yes, and for the first time in my career, the yes felt like it belonged to me. Psychologists talk about agency, the belief that you have control over your actions and their outcomes. Losing my job, my marriage, and my father's approval had stripped me of agency. I felt like life was something happening to me. But building my own company, shaping Horizon's trajectory, reclaiming my voice, that was agency reborn. And with it came a profound shift. I no longer needed external validation. I was writing my own scorecard. Through it all, Rachel was my anchor. She came down every other weekend bringing wine, laughter, and the kind of honesty only best friends can deliver. One night, as we walked along the beach, I admitted, "I'm terrified I'll fail." She smiled. "Good. That means you're doing something worth failing at." Her words etched into me. Fear wasn't a stop sign. It was a compass pointing toward growth. News began to trickle in, clients leaving Whitman and Price, executives resigning, stock prices tumbling. I wasn't surprised. They had built their house of cards on arrogance and deceit, and now it was collapsing. When the Phillips account worth millions annually moved to my firm, I felt a rush of vindication. Not vengeance, but justice. Mark didn't vanish. He spread rumors, claimed I'd forced him into an unfair settlement. But the more he spoke, the smaller he looked. Jessica called me again, once her voice weary. "He's spiraling, and he blames you for everything." I almost laughed. Of course he does. That's who he's always been. But here's the thing, I no longer cared. His narrative was no longer my prison. The most unexpected change came from my father. Months after disowning me, he wrote a letter, handwritten, shaky script. "Claire, I measured success by external achievements, not by character or happiness. In doing so, I nearly lost what matters most, my relationship with my children. I'm sorry. It wasn't full redemption, but it was a crack in the wall. And for the first time, I let myself imagine forgiveness, not for his sake, but for mine." By fall, Wilson Strategic Communications had 3 clients, then 5. I converted the beach house guest room into an office, whiteboards on the walls, sticky notes everywhere, the smell of ocean always seeping in. It wasn't a corporate skyscraper. It was better. It was mine. I often felt his presence there. The man who left me the inheritance that made all this possible. "You're enough exactly as you are," he used to tell me. Now every deal I closed, every client who signed, every strategy that worked, felt like honoring that truth. Resilience isn't about bouncing back to what was. It's about bouncing forward into what can be. I wasn't the same woman who had walked out of Whitman and Price with a cardboard box. She was gone. In her place stood someone scarred but stronger. Someone who understood that ashes aren't endings. They're soil. On the anniversary of my collapse, Rachel and a few close friends gathered at the beach house. We raised glasses of wine under string lights as the waves crashed below. To Claire, Rachel toasted, who lost everything and found herself. I smiled, tears in my eyes. For once, they weren't tears of loss, because this wasn't just survival. This was rebirth. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday. Handwritten. My father's penmanship slanted deliberate familiar in a way that knotted my stomach. I almost didn't open it. For months, his silence had been louder than words, but curiosity, or maybe longing, got the better of me. Claire, it began. I measured success by external achievements, not by character or happiness. In doing so, I nearly lost what matters most, my relationship with my children. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times. Each time the words felt both too small and impossibly heavy. It wasn't redemption, but it was a crack in the wall that had divided us my entire life. 2 weeks later, he called. "Can I come to the beach house?" The question alone shocked me. Henry Thompson didn't ask. He commanded. But here he was asking. When he arrived, he looked older. Shoulders stooped, hair thinner, arrogance softened by something I'd never seen in him before, vulnerability. We sat on the porch overlooking the Atlantic. The silence between us was thick, but not hostile, just uncertain. Finally, he said I was wrong. 3 words I had waited 34 years to hear. "Do you know what it was like," I asked, "growing up in your house? Every grade, every trophy, never enough." He swallowed hard. "I thought I was preparing you for the world. But I was really just repeating what my father did to me." That admission pierced me. Not because it excused him, it didn't, but because it revealed the chain. Generational expectations, the relentless passing down of pressure of love, turned into conditions. "Dad," I said quietly, "I don't need you to measure me anymore. I need you to see me." His eyes brimmed. He nodded. "I'm trying." In the months that followed, I noticed something subtle in my mother. She began to push back. Little things at first, choosing her own restaurants, speaking up when Dad dismissed her. Once on the phone, she admitted Henry doesn't like it, but I told him it's not up for discussion. The shift was small, but monumental. After 40 years in his shadow, she was reclaiming pieces of herself. I wondered if my rebellion had given her permission to find her own. One evening, my brother William visited the beach house. We walked along the shoreline, sand cool beneath our feet. "I envied you," he admitted. "You broke free." I stayed. "Dad runs the family business like a prison. I've been suffocating for years." I stopped, stunned. William, the golden child, envied me. "You can leave," I told him. He shook his head. "It's complicated, but seeing you, it gives me hope that maybe I could someday." Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about excusing the past. It's about releasing its grip on the present. When we carry bitterness, it owns us. Forgiveness doesn't free the offender, it frees the wounded. And when patterns repeat across generations, breaking them isn't just personal, it's ancestral. Every time we choose differently, we alter the script for those who come after. On the 1-year anniversary of my collapse, I hosted a small gathering at the beach house. Rachel, Zoe, Alex, William, even my mother. My father came too awkward but earnest. String lights glowed on the porch. Waves crashed in rhythm. We raised glasses of wine as the sun melted into the horizon. To Claire, Rachel toasted, who lost everything and found herself. Everyone cheered. I looked around at the faces, friends who had held me, family who were learning to love me differently, colleagues who believed in me. For the first time, I felt whole. Healing isn't a destination. It's not a single letter or one gathering on the porch. It's a daily choice to forgive, to rebuild, to live differently than before. As I stood there, the ocean breeze tangling my hair, I realized I wasn't just Claire the survivor or Claire the entrepreneur. I was Claire the daughter learning to forgive, the sister giving hope, the woman rewriting her family's story. And that I knew was the greatest success of all. The storm had passed. Not all at once, not with a single moment of clarity, but slowly, like clouds thinning after a hurricane light slipping through in fragments until the sky finally revealed itself. I had spent a year fighting, surviving, rebuilding. Now standing on the porch of my beach house one early morning, coffee steaming in my hands, I realized survival wasn't enough. I needed new rituals. Practices not for proving myself to anyone else, but for rooting myself in the life I was choosing. Every morning, before emails, before client calls, before the weight of responsibility could press down, I sat facing the Atlantic. I closed my eyes, breathed with the rhythm of the waves, and repeated 3 truths. 1. I am here. 2. I am enough. 3. I am free. Some days I believed them. Some days I didn't. But saying them out loud planted seeds that grew quietly in the background of my mind. The ocean became my therapist. Its constancy reminded me that storms always pass, tides always return, and no pain is permanent. I also rediscovered movement not as punishment for my body, but as celebration. I ran barefoot along the shoreline's salt air, sharp in my lungs. I rolled out a yoga mat on the deck and stretched into poses that made my joints crack, but my spirit expand. Sweat once tied to stress, and deadlines now became release. A way of saying this body is still mine, still capable, still alive. Wilson's strategic communications grew faster than I expected. New clients, new contracts, glowing referrals. But I'd learned the cost of living without boundaries. I promised myself I wouldn't repeat it, so I created a ritual at 7:00 p.m., no matter what I closed my laptop. Some nights work screamed at me from the inbox, but I chose silence. I chose my life. Instead, I cooked dinner sometimes alone, sometimes with Rachel or Zoe. We laughed over burned pasta, drank too much wine, turned ordinary evenings into sacred ones. Another ritual every night, I wrote down 3 things I was grateful for. Some days, it was big, secured a new client. Other days, it was small, the smell of fresh basil in the kitchen. But over time, the practice rewired me. Gratitude shifted my gaze from what was broken to what was blooming. Healing with my father was slow, awkward, unfinished. But with my mother, it was different. She began visiting me at the beach house. We'd sit on the porch with tea, talking about things we never had before, her dreams, her regrets, the parts of her she'd hidden for decades. "Do you ever wish you'd lived differently?" I asked once. She smiled sadly. "Every day. But watching you, Claire, it makes me think it's not too late to claim a little piece of freedom for myself." Her words became part of my rituals too, reminders that it's never too late. Rachel and I developed our own ritual evening walks along the sand. We talked about everything clients, men, fears, laughter. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, just listened to the waves. She once said, "The ocean erases footprints every night." Maybe that's what healing is, allowing the tide to wash away what no longer needs to remain. I carried that image with me. Every few months, I drove inland to small towns, farm stands, quiet trails, no Wi-Fi. These escapes reminded me that the world was wider than my company, wider than my wounds. Life wasn't only about ambition or recovery. It was also about sunsets over cornfields, the smell of wood smoke, laughter with strangers. And then there was Daniel, an ethical investment advisor introduced through Horizon Tech. Our first meeting was professional, discussing sustainable funding models. But as weeks turned into months, our conversations grew less about numbers and more about life. He was patient, gentle, different from the men I had known. We developed a ritual of our own, Saturday morning coffees at a cafe halfway between our towns. Sometimes we talked about markets. Sometimes about childhood memories. Sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence. For the first time, I let myself imagine love not as performance or competition, but as companionship. In psychology, rituals provide structure and meaning. They anchor us in times of uncertainty, reminding us who we are and what we value. My old rituals had been toxic late nights at the office, chasing approval, silencing myself. My new rituals were simple, almost ordinary, but they were sacred. They said I belong to myself now. 1 year after starting my company, I hit a milestone: 10 clients, consistent revenue stability. But when I celebrated, it wasn't with a press release or a flashy party. It was with a quiet dinner on the porch, candles flickering, Rachel and Daniel by my side. Success, I realized, wasn't about applause anymore. It was about peace. It was about building a life where work, love, and self could coexist without one devouring the others. Looking back, the darkest 24 hours of my life had forced me into the deepest transformation. I was no longer the woman who lived for her father's approval, her husband's validation, or her company's title. I was Claire, the woman who meditated with the waves, who closed her laptop at 7, who laughed over wine with friends, who dared to imagine love again. And with every ritual, every choice, every breath, I was writing, not just a new chapter, I was writing a new book. Life had stopped feeling like survival. It had stopped even feeling like recovery. For the first time in years, life felt like choice. The rituals I had built, morning meditations, evening walks, gratitude lists, had rooted me. My business was stable, my friendships strong, my family, though complicated, was finding new rhythms. And then there was Daniel. This chapter of my life wasn't about ashes anymore. It was about growth, about building, loving, giving, about stepping into a future that wasn't defined by the wreckage of the past, but by the vision of what I wanted to create. It began slowly. Coffee dates that turned into dinners. Dinners that turned into weekends. Weekends that turned into plans for the future. Daniel wasn't flashy. He wasn't the charming, smooth-talking type that Mark had been. He was steady, thoughtful, patient. He listened more than he spoke. He asked how my day was and actually cared about the answer. One evening, after cooking dinner together at the beach house, roasted chicken, wine music humming in the background, he looked at me across the table and said, "Claire, with you I feel like I can breathe." The words undid me, because for years I had felt like I was suffocating. Love, I realized, wasn't supposed to feel like performance. It was supposed to feel like air. Still, fear lingered. Late at night, lying beside Daniel, I'd wonder, what if he leaves too? What if I'm not enough? What if I'm too much? The ghosts of betrayal don't vanish overnight. They whisper from dark corners. But I learned to tell myself, this is different. You are different. And love isn't about guarantees. It's about courage. Daniel never rushed me. He let me take down my walls brick by brick, never forcing, only waiting. That patience was its own kind of healing. Wilson's strategic communications expanded. By year 2, we had a small team, 5 employees, then 10. We rented an office in Providence, though I kept the beach house as my sanctuary. In the past, I would have drowned myself in work. But now, I drew firm lines. No emails after dinner, no working weekends unless absolutely necessary. Instead, I invested in my people, mentoring them, creating a culture of respect and creativity, the kind of place I had once longed for at Whitman and Price. Clients noticed. "You're not just a strategist," one told me. "You're a leader people want to follow." For the first time, success felt sustainable. It wasn't built on burnout. It was built on balance. Healing with my father was slow. There were awkward dinners, tense silences, moments when old patterns tried to resurface. But there were also breakthroughs. One evening, he visited the beach house alone. We sat watching the sun dip into the horizon. "Claire," he said quietly, "when I pushed you so hard, I thought I was preparing you. But really, I was afraid. Afraid that if you failed, it meant I failed as a father." The honesty startled me. "Dad, I said I don't need you to carry my life as proof of your worth. I just need you to walk beside me, not ahead of me, not behind me." For once, he nodded without argument. That small shift felt monumental. My mother bloomed in ways I hadn't expected. She joined a book club. She started painting again. She even told me she planned a trip with friends, something she never would have done without my father's permission before. "I told him it wasn't negotiable," she said with a quiet smile. Her small acts of independence weren't just about her. They were a reminder that healing ripples outward. When one person breaks free, it can give others permission to do the same. My brother, too, began making changes. After months of confiding in me, he finally left the family business. "It's terrifying," he admitted over the phone. "But for once, I feel like the decisions are mine." I couldn't stop smiling. My story had given him courage, and now his story gave me hope. Maslow called it self-actualization, becoming the fullest version of yourself, beyond survival, beyond safety, beyond external validation. For years, I had lived at the bottom of that pyramid, clinging to approval, to titles, to relationships that defined me. Now, I was climbing toward the top. Not perfectly, not without stumbles, but steadily. And the view was breathtaking. As my confidence grew, I felt a pull to share my journey. I started small, hosting workshops for women navigating divorce, job loss, or family conflict. We gathered in community centers, coffee shops, sometimes even on the porch of my beach house. I told my story not as a tragedy, but as testimony. I spoke of gaslighting at work, betrayal at home, the collapse that forced me to rebuild. Again and again, women came up afterward, eyes brimming. "Your story is my story," they said. It reminded me pain shared becomes lighter, and healing multiplies when we offer it to others. Daniel and I began traveling together. Nothing extravagant, just long weekends in Vermont, quick trips to New York, hikes in the White Mountains. On one trip, standing on a mountain ridge, wind whipping through our hair, Daniel took my hand and said, "Claire, whatever chapter comes next, I want to write it with you." I didn't answer right away. Tears blurred my vision. But eventually, I whispered, "Me too." One night alone at the beach house, I reflected on the idea of legacy. What do we leave behind? Titles fade, bank accounts, empty houses crumble. But the impact we have on others, the courage we spark, the kindness we extend, that's what endures. I realized my legacy wasn't the job I lost, or even the company I built. It was the story I carried, the one I now shared, the one that reminded people that collapse can be the birthplace of creation. 2 years after the night, everything fell apart. I hosted another gathering at the beach house. Friends, colleagues, family all together under string lights, laughter mingling with the sound of the sea. Rachel raised her glass. "To Claire, who turned survival into strength, strength into freedom, and freedom into joy." I looked around and felt tears rise, but this time they weren't from pain or even relief, they were from gratitude. As the night wound down, I slipped away to the shoreline. The moon painted a silver path across the water. I thought about the girl who had once stood here broken, terrified, believing she had lost everything. And I thought about the woman I had become, whole, loved, free. Life will never stop twisting. There will always be storms. But now I know I am more than the storm. I am the tide that keeps rising. This wasn't just another ending. This was a new chapter. I'm standing here tonight, barefoot in the sand, the Atlantic humming its eternal song. The same ocean that heard my sobs when I thought my life was over. The same ocean that listened when I whispered my first promises to myself. Tonight, it listens again. But now, my voice is not breaking. It is steady. Because I have something to say, not just to myself, but to anyone who finds themselves where I once stood, broken, lost, convinced that the story is finished. It isn't. I used to believe security was a paycheck, a marriage, a title, a father's approval. But when all of those crumbled, I discovered something harder, fiercer, more permanent, the kind of security that comes from knowing you can survive the worst and still rise. Security is not what you hold. It's what holds you, and only you can build it. When my life imploded, I saw who people really were. Some betrayed me, some abandoned me, some surprised me with their loyalty. But most importantly, I saw myself. I saw the ways I had silenced my own voice, shrunk to fit inside someone else's expectations, mistaken achievement for worth. Crisis doesn't just expose others, it exposes you. And what you do with that knowledge, that's your rebirth. Revenge wasn't what saved me. Success wasn't even what saved me. What saved me was rebuilding stone by stone, ritual by ritual, day by day. Creating a life aligned with who I truly am, not who others wanted me to be. Healing is not glamorous. It is messy. It is lonely. It is slow. But it is worth it. In my workshops, I've met women who carry stories like mine. One, Maria, whispered through tears that her husband left after 30 years, emptying their accounts. She thought she was too old to start over. Now she runs a bakery out of her kitchen, laughter, returning to her home with every loaf she sells. Another, Jasmine, was fired, unjustly blacklisted in her industry. She sat in my circle, shaking with shame. 6 months later, she emailed me. I opened my own consulting firm. For the first time, I don't dread Mondays. Their stories are proof resilience is contagious. I think of my mother, 40 years under my father's shadow, and yet in her 60s, she started making choices of her own. Book clubs, art classes, trips with friends. Her freedom came late, but it came, and it taught me this: it's never too late to claim your life. I think of William, terrified to leave the family business, but finally daring to breathe on his own terms. He once told me, "You showed me it's possible." Sometimes the bravest thing you can do for others is to rewrite your own script. Psychologists define resilience as the ability to adapt and recover from adversity. But I think it's more than that. Resilience is the courage to rebuild a life that looks nothing like the one you lost. Authentic living means aligning your choices with your truth, not with expectations or fear. And hope is not naive. Hope is rebellious. It dares to say, "This is not the end. There is more." I still remember the night I sat in that hotel room, bank account empty, marriage, shattered, family gone. I thought I have nothing left. But looking back now, I realize I had everything I needed: breath in my lungs, a brain that could think, a heart that could break and still beat. That was enough to start again. That is always enough to start again. So, if you are listening, if you are reading, if you are standing in the ashes of your life, hear me. You are not finished. Your worth is not tied to the person who left the job that fired you, the family that failed you. Your worth is in the fact that you are still here, breathing, beating, capable of choosing again. Every sunrise is an invitation. Every breath is a beginning. Start small. Write one line in a journal. Walk one block. Cook one meal. Call one friend. Do it again tomorrow, and again the day after. These are not just habits. They are declarations: I am alive. I am rebuilding. I am enough. If I could go back to that night, to the woman curled on the hotel bed, I would whisper, "You will lose everything you thought you needed, and you will gain everything you never imagined. Hold on. You're about to meet yourself. As I finish writing this, the tide is rolling in. It will erase the footprints I left on the sand today. But tomorrow, I will leave new ones. That's what life is. Footprints, tides, beginnings again and again. So here is my message. No matter how shattered your life feels, no matter how final the ending seems, the tide always rises. And so will you.